I have 7 children.
You lied.
Mail order bride arrives at a ranch, finds 7 kids. One lie and a war she never expected. Have you ever made a choice so reckless, so utterly beyond reason, that you knew even as your hand signed the paper that you were either saving to yourself or destroying what little remained of your life? Eleanor Ashford had. 3 years after burying her son in Pennsylvania soil, still frozen from winter. 3 years after cutting her husband down from the barn rafter, she stood in a train station with a one-way ticket to a man whose face she knew only from a single blurred photograph. The ticket was departure. The ticket was forgetting. The ticket was the last desperate act of a woman who had already died once and was trying against all logic to be born again. But Eleanor didn't know, couldn't know, that the man waiting at the other end of that rail line had lied, that a few children who need a mother's care meant 7. That love, when it finally found her again, would come wrapped in a legal battle that would demand she become something she'd never been, a woman willing to point a loaded rifle at another human being and mean it. If you've ever felt that pull towards something unknown, that terrible, beautiful gravity of a life you can't yet see, drop us 7 inches, the comments. We're in this together. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday 3 months before Eleanor found herself on that train. It came tucked inside the Western Tribune, a newspaper Mrs. Murphy brought up with evening tea, claiming Eleanor needed something to lift your spirits, dear. You've been so dreadfully pale. Eleanor had read the advertisement twice before her hands began to shake. Seeking a woman of character and gentle heart to join a widower, 32 inches, Red Willow Creek, Wyoming territory. I own substantial land and offer a comfortable home. My children need a mother's care. I offer respect, partnership, and a future as wide as the western sky. Correspondents welcomed Silas Hale. Children, plural. Eleanor had assumed 2, perhaps 3. She'd taught children for 5 years at Millbrook School, restless, bright-eyed creatures who still believed the world held magic. She knew how to braid hair, how to calm nightmares, how to make a child feel seen. What she didn't know was how to stop seeing her own son's face in every dark-haired boy who passed her on the street. The correspondence had been careful, formal. Silas wrote of late nights, mending fences of cattle growing fat on summer grass, of children who range in age and temperament, but all good-hearted. He never specified how many. Eleanor, drowning in the gray monotony of Millbrook, the mill smoke, the pitying glances, the empty room where she folded other people's linens, hadn't thought to ask. She'd written back about her love of teaching, her modest savings, her belief that contentment is not surrender, but a kind of courage. Silas had replied with a marriage proposal and train fare. Eleanor had accepted both. Now, stepping off the train into the crystalline October air of Red Willow Creek, Eleanor felt her lungs burn with cold and something like terror. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, a main street of wooden buildings that seemed to lean into each other for support, a scattering of houses, mountains rising in the distance like the walls of a fortress. She couldn't escape. Silas stood apart from the small crowd, tall and lean, dark hair, touched with silver at the temples, despite his 32 years. His eyes were blue, not warm blue, but the blue of high-altitude ice. When they met hers across the platform, something in Eleanor's chest clenched. Miss Ashford. He removed his hat. His voice was low, careful. Welcome to Red Willow Creek, Mr. Hale. Eleanor's throat was dry. Thank you for inviting me into your life. He offered his arm. His hand, when she took it, was calloused and warm through the fabric of his sleeve. I hope I can prove worthy of the trust you've placed in me, he said quietly. Then, softer, I need to tell you something before we reach the ranch. Eleanor's stomach dropped. You're already married. No. A muscle jumped in his jaw. But I wasn't entirely forthcoming about the children. How many, Eleanor heard herself ask, though part of her didn't want to know. Silas didn't answer. He just helped her into the wagon, loaded her trunk with movements that were too controlled, too deliberate. They drove first to the church, a small wooden building that smelled of pine and beeswax. Reverend Morrison, kindly and gray-bearded, married them in 10 minutes. Eleanor repeated vows she barely heard, felt the gold band slide onto her finger like a shackle or a lifeline, she couldn't tell which. On the road to the ranch, Silas finally spoke. "I have 7 children." Eleanor's vision tunneled. 7. The word was impossible, monstrous. She'd prepared herself for 3, maybe 4, but 7, they're not all mine by blood. Silas continued, his voice tight. "My wife Margaret and I, we couldn't turn away children who had nowhere else to go. Orphans. Abandoned. Some too young to remember their real parents. Margaret died 2 years ago, accident during a storm, and I've been managing alone, barely managing." "You lied." Eleanor's voice was flat. "Yes. You knew if you told me I wouldn't come." "Yes." The wagon crested a hill. Below, nestled in a valley where Red Willow Creek cut silver through autumn grass, stood a 2-story log house. Smoke rose from the chimney. Outbuildings scattered across the property, barn, corral, chicken coop. It looked prosperous, solid, and on the porch, lined up like stair-steps, stood 7 children. Eleanor's hands went numb. The oldest was a boy 15, maybe tall and serious, shoulders squared like he was ready to catch whatever blow the world threw next. Beside him, a girl of 13, dark braid-mended dress hands folded carefully. Then the others stepping down in age, twin boys, a younger girl, a toddler, barely steady on his feet, and an infant in the 13-year-old's arms. 7 faces, 7 sets of eyes watching the wagon approach with expressions Eleanor recognized from her, years teaching the wary, careful stillness of children who'd learned that adults made promises they didn't keep. "Silas." Eleanor's voice cracked. "I can't, please." He pulled the wagon to a stop, still some distance from the house. "Let me explain why I didn't tell you. It wasn't to deceive you, Eleanor. It was because I was afraid. Afraid no woman in her right mind would take on 7 children who aren't her own. Afraid I'd watch my children grow up without the mother they desperately need. Afraid of spending the rest of my life alone." Eleanor stared at the children. The oldest boy had moved slightly in front of the younger ones, protecting them from her. "Tell me about them," she heard herself say. "They're real stories. All of it. Right now." Silas took a breath. Samuel, the oldest, his parents died in a wagon accident when he was 8. Sheriff was going to send him to an orphanage back east. Margaret insisted we keep him. Ruth, the girl holding the baby her mother died in childbirth. Her father brought her and her baby brother to us, said he was heading to California to make his fortune. That was 3 years ago. We haven't heard from him since. The baby is Ruth's brother Timothy. He's 3 now. Doesn't remember any other life. Silas's voice softened. The twins, Michael and Matthew, they're 9, and their little sister Elizabeth, she's 11. Their father was a drifter who got sick and died in our barn one winter. We found the children hiding in his wagon, half-starved. Margaret nursed them back to health. We kept them. And the infant Mary, she's mine and Margaret's, 18 months old. She'll never remember her mother. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but the opposite, expanding. These weren't Silas's children by blood. They were his by choice, by the simple, radical act of not turning away. "There's more," Silas said, and now his voice carried a thread of real fear. "Margaret's brother-in-law, Harold Winters, he's been trying to gain custody since Margaret died. Claims we have no legal right to keep children we're not related to. He owns a textile mill in Pennsylvania. He wants workers, Eleanor. Children he can pay pennies and work 12 hours a day." Eleanor's blood went cold. How immediate is the threat he's been corresponding with the territorial judge. And now, Silas met her eyes. "Now he knows I've married. He'll come soon. And if we can't prove we're a proper family, that you're a real mother to these children, he might win." The weight of it settled on Eleanor like snow-heavy cold, suffocating. She'd come west to escape grief, to find some quiet purpose in caring for a manageable family. Instead, she'd married into a war. She looked at the children again. 7 lives, 7 futures that depended on what she decided in the next 60 seconds. Samuel was watching her with an expression far too old for 15. He knew she might leave. He was already preparing to hold his siblings together when she did. Eleanor Ashford, widow teacher woman who'd buried her son and cut down her husband, made a choice. "All right," she said. "Let's go meet our children." The foundation. The house smelled of wood smoke and something baking bread, maybe, or biscuits. Ruth had been cooking. The scent drifted low through the rafters, soft and familiar, wrapping itself around Eleanor like a shawl she hadn't realized she'd been needing. The girl moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, setting mismatched cups on a table, scarred by years of knives' elbows and family meal. The boards under her boots creaked with the same tired rhythm as the wind at the window. The other children found their places with the unconscious ease of long habit. Someone passed butter. Someone else refilled the kettle. Timothy climbed onto a chair too tall for him and balanced on his knees. Mary babbled softly from the crook of Eleanor's arm, one tiny hand tangled in the fabric of her skirt. The baby had reached for her the moment they entered the house with that reckless trust only the very young possess. Eleanor, still half frozen from the day, hadn't had the strength to resist. She stood now in the center of the main room, the lamplight trembling across her traveling bag and dusting her face in gold. It was a room built for living, not display rough-hewn beams, a hearth blackened from 100 fires, curtains mended with care. Life had left its fingerprints everywhere. "Children," Silas said. His voice carried that quiet authority Eleanor was only beginning to understand. "This is Mrs. Hale. She's traveled a very long way to become part of our family. I want each of you to introduce yourselves properly." The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of boots. Samuel stepped forward first. He was taller, up-close shoulders, still narrow from youth, but already bearing the stance of a man. "Ma'am, I'm Samuel." His tone was polite, but guarded his palms rough with callus and Sunday, "Welcome to our home. We're glad you're here." "Thank you, Samuel." Eleanor met his eyes. "Your father tells me you help manage the ranch. That takes real character in someone your age." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe disbelief. He was used to being addressed as labor, not as a person. A faint color touched his cheek. "Yes, ma'am. I do my best." Ruth came next, wiping her hands on her apron before giving a small curtsy. "I'm Ruth, ma'am. I help with the house and the little ones. I hope you'll be happy here." Her voice was soft, the edges frayed from caution. That was when Eleanor noticed the faint mark high on her left arm, the kind of yellowed bruise that told of rough handling several days past. It peeked from beneath her rolled sleeve. "Ruth." Eleanor's voice was gentle but unwavering. "That bruise, how did you get it?" The room froze. Even the kettle's simmer seemed to hush. Ruth's eyes darted toward Silas, then back again. I fell, ma'am, carrying firewood. It's nothing." Eleanor looked at Silas. His expression had gone ashen. "Tell her the truth, Ruth," he said, voice low. The girl's chin trembled. "A man came last week. Mr. Winters. He grabbed my arm when I tried to go inside. Said he was assessing the children's condition and I needed to cooperate. Papa made him leave, but..." She stopped. The quiet after her words felt like a storm gathering behind glass. Eleanor felt something ignite in her chest. Not the hot flare of anger, but something colder, steady, deliberate. A flame that burned blue. "Ruth," she said, setting Mary carefully in the cradle near the fire. "From now on, if anyone tries to touch you or your brothers or sisters without permission, you scream. You run. You find your father or me. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded quickly, eyes wide as the baby's. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor squeezed her shoulder light but sure. "Good girl." The twins came next, Michael and Matthew identical, except for a thin scar above Matthew's left brow. They stood shoulder-to-shoulder, mirror images of quiet endurance. "We help with the cattle," Michael said. "And the horses," Matthew added. "Papa says we're almost as good as grown men." Eleanor smiled. "I'm sure you are. I'll need teachers then. I've never lived on a ranch before." Their faces lit for the briefest second, the kind of pride only boys feel when the work they do is noticed. Elizabeth followed, moving so softly, the floor barely noticed her weight. She kept her arms tight around herself, her dress too thin for the season. "I'm Elizabeth," she whispered. "I help with the garden. And the chickens." Eleanor knelt, meeting her gaze. Elizabeth, I love garden. Will you show me yours tomorrow? I want to learn how things grow out here. I've heard the soil's stubborn like the people. The girl blinked, startled. Really? You want me to teach you? Absolutely. Eleanor smiled. I've always believed good teachers are everywhere, especially in gardens. Elizabeth's lips trembled into a shy, astonished grin. Then Timothy bounded forward, all motion and joy. I'm Timothy. I can ride a horse all by myself. I can teach you. Laughter slipped out of Eleanor before she could stop at the first real sound of happiness she'd made in 3 years. I'll need all the help I can get, Timothy. He puffed up proudly. I'll teach you how not to fall. Mary toddled forward, then holding to Eleanor's skirt with one small hand. Her dark eyes were solemn, ancient in their sadness. Mama, she said softly. The word struck something inside Eleanor, so deep she could barely breathe. This child had no memory of the woman who'd given her life, only the ache of needing one. Eleanor bent low, her voice barely more than breath. Yes, sweetheart, I'm your mama now. Silas turned away, his jaw set tight, his shoulders shaking once before he mastered himself. That night the wind came down from the hills, carrying with it the smell of sage and frost. The ranch slept, but Eleanor lay awake, listening to the logs shift in the hearth. After the children's footsteps faded overhead, she found Silas at the kitchen table, elbows braced on the wood, untouched coffee cooling between them. I need to know everything, she said, breaking the silence. About Harold Winters. About Margaret's death. About what we're truly facing. Silas didn't speak right away. The lamplight carved deep lines across his face, the wear of years compacted into one long night. Margaret, he began slowly, wasn't well after Mary's birth. She pushed herself harder than she should have. Wanted to prove she could still manage the ranch, the storms, the stock. That day lightning hit near the barn. She went out anyway to bring the cattle in. His voice faltered. She fell, broke her leg. The rain came down hard, and by the time I reached her, he swallowed. It took 3 days. The children heard her crying from the downstairs room. There was nothing the doctor could do. He stared into the dark window, seeing something she couldn't. She made me promise I wouldn't let her death become another abandonment. That I'd keep the family together no matter the cost. Eleanor listened in silence, hands folded tight around her cooling cup. And Harold Winters, her brother-in-law Silas, said bitterly, Margaret's sister married him back east. He showed up 3 months after she died, claimed he had a right to the children as blood kin to Mary, by marriage at least. But that's not what he wanted. He looked up, eyes hard now. He wanted labor. He runs a textile mill near Harrisburg, uses children younger than Samuel. He's been building a case accusing me of neglect, saying I'm keeping an unlicensed orphanage. Said Margaret's death was my fault. Said I've corrupted the morals of the household by bringing in strangers. Eleanor absorbed this, the pieces clicking into place like ice forming on a pond. What kind of timeline are we looking at? He'll come as soon as he learns you're here. Days, maybe a week. He'll bring papers, lawyers, and some official willing to listen if the bribe's good enough. Eleanor straightened in her chair. Then we prepare. Silas blinked. Prepare. We document everything, she said, her voice calm and measured. Their health, their schooling, their chores, their happiness. We make sure the town sees them thriving. Reverend Morrison can vouch for us. The school teacher, too. The merchants in town will know we pay fairly. We'll make ourselves so obviously a real family that no court could tear us apart. Silas stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. You're not leaving. I'm not leaving, Eleanor said simply. But Silas, if we're going to win this, you'll need to teach me to shoot.
You lied.
His eyes widened. Eleanor, I don't. She raised a hand. I'm not asking to fight wars, but I won't stand by while a man like Winters lays a hand on a child again. If I'm to be their mother, then I'll protect them as one. Silas studied her in the quiet, the way a man studies a sunrise he didn't expect to see again. Finally, he nodded once. We start tomorrow. I'll fetch the Winchester from the barn after chores. A silence followed, heavy but not bleak. The kind that settles between two people who've chosen the same road, however rough. Eleanor looked toward the stairs where 7 small dreams slept in borrowed peace. For the first time since she'd stepped off the train, she didn't feel like a stranger in this place. The walls no longer loomed, they listened. The house itself seemed to breathe beside her, wood creaking like a heartbeat. Outside, the wind swept across the prairie, whispering through the cottonwoods. Somewhere, a coyote called its lonely cry, fading into distance. Eleanor sat back in her chair and let the sound wash over her. She had crossed half a continent to escape her past, only to find herself standing guard over a new one. But for the first time in years, her fear had a purpose. And in that purpose, she felt something stirring, something that might one day become hope, the preparation. The next morning arrived cold and sharp, the kind of cold that cut through wool and bone alike. Frost silvered the grass outside the kitchen window, turning the meadow into a sheet of pale glass. Smoke rose thin and blue from the chimney, vanishing into the colorless dawn. Eleanor woke before sunrise, a habit from her teaching, years that her body refused to unlearn. The room was still half dark, lit only by the fading embers in the hearth, and the distant sound of roosters calling somewhere across the valley. The air smelled of last night's ash, and the faint sweetness of bread Ruth had left cooling on the counter. She pulled on a borrowed wool skirt, laced her boots by touch, and crossed the creaking floorboards to the window. Outside, the barn crouched in the morning mist, a low shape against the whitening hills. She saw movement there, steady, rhythmic, the silhouette of Silas forking hay to the horses. Even from this distance, his motions were unhurried, but exact, as though every task, no matter how small, carried its own kind of prayer. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the cold. The frost cracked under her boots as she crossed the yard. Her breath came out in white clouds that dissolved against the blue air. Silas turned when she reached the barn door. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough from sleep and silence. "When do we start?" He blinked. "Start what? Shooting practice?" Her tone left no room for doubt. "You said Harold will come back. I need to be ready." For a moment, he only stared, as though trying to fit the proper composed schoolteacher from Pennsylvania into the image of the woman before him, hair braided back, sleeves, rolled eyes, fierce as winter light. After breakfast, he said at last, setting the pitchfork aside, "We'll take the Winchester and ride up to the north pasture. The hills will muffle the sound so the children won't hear." Eleanor nodded once. "Good. I don't want them more frightened than they already are." The shooting lessons began that same day and soon became their ritual. Each morning after breakfast, while Ruth oversaw the younger children's reading lessons and Samuel worked the fence line, Eleanor and Silas would saddle the horses and ride north. The frost lingered late in those early weeks, sparkling on the fields like broken glass as they carried the Winchester, a box of brass cartridges, and a dozen tin cans salvaged from the general store. The first time Eleanor fired the rifle, the shot went so wide it startled a crow off a fence post 2 fields away. The recoil slammed into her shoulder hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. Her next attempt kicked up a puff of dirt nowhere near the target. But she didn't flinch, didn't apologize. She simply reloaded, reset her feet, as Silas had shown her, and tried again. "You're pulling right," he said, moving behind her. His voice was quiet, but firm, the kind meant for breaking horses or teaching patience. "Keep both eyes open. Don't fight the rifle. Don't brace against it. Let the kick surprise you each time." "That seems counterintuitive," she muttered, rubbing her shoulder. "Most things worth doing are." He gave the faintest smile. Again. The next shot clipped the can's edge and sent it spinning. Eleanor's breath caught. The sound echoed against the rocks like applause. By the third morning, she was hitting 3 cans out of 10. By the end of the week, 7 out of 10. Her shoulder was permanently bruised. Her hands had begun to blister and harden from the wooden stock. But instead of discomfort, she felt something steadier growing in her, a quiet confidence, an understanding that she was no longer defenseless in this place. The weight of the Winchester across her lap became a kind of promise. "You're thinking about it too much," Silas said one morning after she missed 3 in a row. "How can I not think about it?" she snapped, before catching herself. He shook his head slowly. "Shooting isn't about thought. It's about breathing, becoming still enough inside that your hands know what to do without your mind interfering. Eleanor lowered the rifle, the wind burning her eyes. How can I not think when every time I aim I see Harold's face? I see him standing in this yard shouting about laws and rights while he drags those children away. I see the way Ruth flinched when she said his name. Silas stepped closer, his boots crunching in the frost. He laid one rough hand over hers on the rifle. You're not shooting, Harold. You're shooting a tin can. Nothing more. If the day comes when you need this weapon for something else, your body will remember. But today, you're just learning. Eleanor drew a slow breath. The mountains loomed behind him, silent witnesses. All right, she said. She raised the rifle again. In out the steady rhythm of breath. She stopped thinking, stopped imagining. Just listened to the wind, the beat of her own pulse, and squeezed the trigger. The can flew off its post and clattered against a stone. There, Silas said softly. That's it. A smile ghosted across Eleanor's lips. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt capable of altering her fate. But shooting was only part of her preparation. Afternoons became hers to claim, and she claimed them with purpose. She began riding into town 3 times a week, wearing her plainest dress and carrying herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had no time for gossip. Silas had once been a familiar figure there, but after Margaret's death, he'd withdrawn, letting the ranch and his reputation slowly fade. Eleanor meant to change that. Her first stop was Reverend Morrison's church, a small white building at the edge of town, the bell rope worn smooth from decades of calloused hand. The Reverend, a gentleman with a tired face, welcomed her into the study, lined with hymnals and dust. She spoke plainly. If Harold Winters returns with legal force, we'll need testimony from respected members of this community. People who can say what kind of home these children have, how they're raised, how they're treated. The Reverend folded his hands, his brow creasing. Mrs. Hale, the law is not kind to families like yours. Blood relations weigh heavily in such matters. Mr. Winters, for all his faults, is Mary's uncle by marriage. Eleanor met his gaze squarely. Then we make the law irrelevant. We build such overwhelming public support that no judge would dare rule against us without risking his own standing. He blinked. That's remarkably strategic for a schoolteacher. She allowed a small smile. I've managed classrooms of 40 children, armed with ink bottles and mischief. I learned early that authority isn't given. It's built one act at a time until people forget you ever lacked it. The Reverend chuckled under his breath, admiration softening his expression. You're not what I expected when Silas wrote that he'd found a mail-order bride. Good, she said. Harold Winters isn't expecting me either. Her next call was at the small schoolhouse, a single-room building painted the color of pale cornmeal. The teacher, Miss Pritchard, was a thin woman with nervous hands and 15 years of service behind her spectacles. Eleanor arrived with Ruth in tow, introducing her not as a ward, but as a student eager to learn. Ruth's had to help with the house since her mother died, Eleanor explained. But she's been reading through McGuffey's Fifth Reader on her own. I was hoping she might attend your classes regularly if there's space. Miss Pritchard adjusted her glasses, intrigued. She'd heard of the Hale family, of course everyone had, but rumor had painted them as half-wild, unschooled, pitiful. The girl standing before her, however, was none of those things. Ruth's braid was neat, her hands clean, her eyes alert. Miss Pritchard laid an open primer before her. Can you read the passage at the bottom, dear? Ruth nodded. Her voice was clear but trembled slightly at first. Then it steadied, gaining rhythm as she reached the longer sentences. When she finished, the teacher's expression softened into genuine astonishment. Mrs. Hale, she said, this child is exceptionally bright. If she continues at this pace, she could qualify for teacher training herself one day. Ruth's mouth parted, her eyes wide as the prairie sky. Really, I could become a teacher, if you work hard and want it badly enough. Yes, Miss Pritchard said. That evening, as they walked the long dirt road back toward the ranch, Ruth's steps were lighter than Eleanor had ever seen. Did she really mean it, the girl whispered. About teacher training, she meant it. Ruth bit her lip. I never thought I could be more than what I am. Eleanor squeezed her hand. You already are. The world just needed to see it. Ruth's eyes shimmered. I see it now. Over the next weeks, Eleanor visited every corner of Red Willow Creek. The general store, the blacksmith's forge, the doctor's small clinic by the river. She never spoke of fear or danger. She spoke of family, of responsibility, of community. And people listened. At the general store, she chatted with Mrs. Larkin over bolts of calico and bags of flour. She let slip small details, the children's chores, their schoolwork, the progress of the garden. Elizabeth tended. Every anecdote became a seed of testimony. At the forge, she waited while the blacksmith tempered a plowshare. His arms were black with soot, his eyes sharp under his brim. "You're not from here," he said, without accusation, just fact. "No," Eleanor answered, "but I intend to belong here." He wiped his hands on a rag. "You're fighting an uphill battle. Winters is wealthy, and men like him don't lose easily." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "If he wins, this town loses something more than 7 children. He'll have proved that money can buy family, that law means ownership instead of protection. That's a precedent no community can survive." The blacksmith studied her for a long time, then nodded slowly. "You've got iron in you, Mrs. Hale. I'll speak for you if the time comes." Word traveled faster than wagons in a small frontier town. By the second week, everyone knew that the new Mrs. Hale wasn't simply a mail-order bride, but a force polite, unyielding, quietly gathering allies one handshake at a time. Back at the ranch, the days folded into a rhythm that almost resembled peace. The mornings began with the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the thud of hooves in the corral. The afternoons belonged to chores, reading lessons, and laughter that felt less forced with each passing day. Samuel's wary distance began to thaw. He asked Eleanor's opinion on fence angles, on feed mixes, on things that mattered to a working man. Ruth studied late into the night, candlelight flickering against her open books. The twins built a miniature corral out of sticks for Timothy's amusement. Elizabeth planted early spinach near the porch and proudly showed Eleanor the first tiny green shoots breaking through the soil. It wasn't a perfect family, but it was a living one. And every morning up in the north pasture, Eleanor still practiced. The sound of gunfire carried faintly across the valley, and the echo seemed to reassure rather than alarm the household. The children began to treat it like any other sound of safety, like the ringing of the dinner bell or the neigh of a horse coming home. One crisp morning, as Eleanor loaded a new cartridge, she caught Silas, watching her arms crossed, a ghost of pride, softening his features. "You're better than most men I've taught," he said. She arched a brow. "How many men have you taught exactly enough to know none of them listened half as well?" Eleanor smiled, faint but real. "That's because I can't afford to fail." Silas nodded once. "Neither can I." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind whistle through the fence wire. Then Silas said, "Whatever happens when Winters returns, you won't face it alone." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked toward the horizon where the sun spilled gold across the peaks. The land felt vast, perilous, alive. "No," she said finally. "We face it as a family." Silas tipped his hat, the smallest of smiles on his lips. That's all I needed to hear. By month's end, the ranch had begun to hum with something new. Not fear, not merely survival, but a pulse of belonging. The neighbors noticed. So did the preacher, the shopkeepers, even the mail clerk who handled Silas's letters. They started calling her Mrs. Hale not out of politeness, but out of genuine recognition. And when talk of Harold Winters' return began circulating through the telegraph lines, the town didn't whisper pity anymore. They whispered warning. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the ground beneath her feet solidify, not the soil of Pennsylvania, cold and mournful, but this raw red earth that answered to courage rather than grief. And as winter crept closer, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever storm was coming, she would meet it head-on, rifle steady, breath calm, not as a stranger, not as a teacher, not even as a widow trying to forget, but as a woman who had finally learned how to stand her ground, building bonds. The days at the ranch had begun to run together in a rhythm that was quiet, almost deceptive. On the surface, It looked like ordinary living chores, meals, lessons, nights by the fire. But underneath, Eleanor was building something more fragile and precious than the fences Samuel repaired or the bread Ruth baked. She was building trust, not the shallow kind that comes from kind words or promises easily made. The real kind. The kind that had to be earned day by day in small silences and patient acts until it became a steady pulse between people who had forgotten how to believe in it. Samuel was the hardest. He'd been abandoned once, then orphaned again. Margaret's death had left him raw and wary, an old man in a boy's body. The lines of labor and grief were already etched on his face, though he couldn't have been more than 15. He spoke little and smiled even less. But Eleanor noticed the way he stayed late every evening in the barn polishing tools, oiling harnesses, tending to the wagon wheels with careful precision. So she started joining him. She didn't intrude. She simply brought her mending or a book, sitting quietly on a crate near the lamplight while he worked. Some nights she read aloud to herself, softly, almost under her breath. Old passages from Pilgrim's Progress or Emerson, the kind of words that filled the space without demanding an answer. Other nights, she just listened. The rasp of sandpaper, the slow rhythm of breathing, the creak of leather. It took nearly a week before Samuel spoke. He didn't look up from the bridle he was stitching. "Why'd you stay?" he asked abruptly. "When you saw there were 7 of us, why didn't you just get back on that train?" Eleanor set down her sewing. The lamplight made her hands look older, the veins standing out like rivers on a map. "Because I saw you all standing on that porch," she said quietly, getting ready to be disappointed again. "And I realized I'd spent the last 3 years doing the same thing, waiting for the world to take something else from me. I was tired of preparing for lost Samuel. I wanted to prepare for something else." He glanced at her, his expression guarded. What for a family worth fighting for? Samuel's fingers stilled on the bridle. "Margaret used to say something like that," he murmured. "She said the only way to stop being afraid of losing people was to love them so hard that even losing them couldn't take it away." Eleanor's heart tightened. She was right. But she died anyway. His voice cracked low and fierce, and it hurt so much I wanted to die too. The confession hung in the air, stark as a bullet hole. Eleanor swallowed. "I know that kind of pain." She stared down at her hands. "My son died 3 years ago." Whooping cough. "He was 5. For weeks I held him while he fought for breath. When he died, part of me did too." Samuel looked up sharply. "You had a son, James," she said softly. "He loved horses. Strawberries. The sound of rain on the roof. He died, terrified. And I could do nothing but hold him. My husband couldn't bear the grief. He took his own life 6 months later." She wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand steady, despite the tears. "So yes, Samuel, I know what it means to lose everything. I know what it's like to believe love isn't worth the cost." Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "But you stayed anyway." "I stayed," she said, "because I finally understood that Margaret was right. Love doesn't vanish. When someone dies, it just changes shape. Your love for her is still here in the way you look after your brothers and sisters, in how you keep this ranch running, like it's sacred ground. You're not afraid because you're weak, Samuel. You're afraid because you loved her deeply." His shoulders shook, the armor breaking. "I don't want to replace her." "You're not replacing her," Eleanor said softly. "You're making room. That's not betrayal. That's growth." He tried to hold it in, but grief came like floodwater, hot, sudden, unstoppable. The boy who had held himself together for 2 long years finally broke. Eleanor reached for him, no hesitation. He came apart in her arms, 15 years old, and sobbing like a child who'd been told to be strong too long. "I'm so tired," he gasped, between ragged breaths. "I'm so tired of being strong." "Then rest," she whispered, cradling his head against her shoulder. "I'm here now. You can rest." They stayed like that until the lamp burned low and the barn filled with quiet. When he finally pulled away, she saw it, the first small crack in his walls. Not broken yet, but softening. A beginning. Ruth was different. Their bond formed easily, 2 women surrounded by people who needed them, each understanding the other's exhaustion without words. But Eleanor knew Ruth had been forced to grow up too quickly. The girl carried herself like someone older, her hands already rough from work, her eyes too serious. One evening, while they prepared dinner together, Eleanor said softly, "You've been mothering these children since you were 10. That's too young, Ruth. Too much weight for one pair of shoulders." Ruth's jaw tightened. Someone had to. After Ma Margaret died, Papa couldn't do it all. "The little ones, I know," Eleanor interrupted gently. "You did beautifully. But you're 13. You deserve to have a childhood, too." Ruth's fingers stilled in the dough she was kneading. "I don't even know what that means anymore. I don't know what I want, except for everyone to be safe." "Then let's start there." Eleanor smiled faintly. "You love to read, don't you?" "Yes, and you're good with numbers. I've seen the ledgers you keep for the household." Ruth flushed with shy pride. "You explain things to the little ones better than I do sometimes," Eleanor continued. "Those are the makings of a teacher, Ruth. You could do that one day." Ruth shook her head. "But what about the children? If I go to school, who'll take care of them?" "You're not leaving," Eleanor said. "You're growing. There's a difference." She took Ruth's flour-dusted hands and held them. "You're allowed to dream again. The weight isn't just yours anymore." Tears filled Ruth's eyes, quick, startled, unguarded. "I want to be like you," she whispered. "And like Ma Margaret. I want to teach children who have nobody else." "Then that's what you'll do," Eleanor said, voice firm with conviction. "We'll make sure of it." That night, when Ruth kissed her goodnight, it wasn't out of duty. It was the first time she did it out of love. The twins Michael and Matthew came next. Their closeness was both their strength and their camouflage. To strangers, they were interchangeable, a pair of restless shadows darting through the yard. But Eleanor learned to tell them apart within a week. Michael's eyes darted, constantly hungry for how things worked: the gears of the pump, the hinge of a door, the clock mechanism in the parlor. Matthew's focus was gentler, slower. He understood living creatures better than people. So she gave them different responsibilities. Michael became her mechanic, fixing the water pump when it stuttered, oiling the hinges, even helping Samuel patch the wagon axle. Eleanor taught him how to listen to the rhythm of the pump and hear trouble before it broke. Matthew she trusted with the newborn foal, a nervous, skittish creature that shied at every sound. Day after day, she found him in the corral speaking softly to the horse until it took oats from his hand. "You're good with him," she said one afternoon, resting her elbows on the fence. Matthew shrugged, embarrassed. "Animals make sense. They don't lie or change their minds. If you're patient, they trust you." "People can be like that too," Eleanor said quietly. "You just have to give them the same patience." He studied her, skeptical but thoughtful. "You're not like most people." "How so?" "Most people look at me and Michael and see the same person. You look harder. Because you're not the same. You're two souls who happen to share a face." For a second, the boy's stoic mask slipped, replaced by something warm and startled. "Thank you, Mrs. Hale." Elizabeth was a harder case. She had mastered invisibility, slipping through rooms like a ghost, never loud enough to be scolded, never idle enough to draw notice. Eleanor understood that kind of vanishing act. It was the armor of children who'd learned that being unseen was the safest way to exist. So Eleanor sought her out carefully. She praised her work in the garden, asked her opinions during supper, let her read aloud during evenings by the fire. But progress was slow. Trust with children like Elizabeth couldn't be coaxed with affection. It had to be proven through consistency. Then one afternoon, Eleanor found her behind the chicken coop face, buried in her arms, shoulders shaking. "Elizabeth, sweetheart," she said softly. "What's wrong?" The girl lifted her head, eyes red and swollen. "I heard Ruth and Samuel talking. They said, if Mr. Winters comes, he might not want all of us, that he might only take the ones old enough to work in the mill. That's me." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She knelt in the dirt beside her. "And you're afraid he'll take you away." Elizabeth nodded, her voice breaking. "If he takes me, maybe he'll leave the little ones. I could live with that if it keeps them safe." "Stop." Eleanor's tone sharpened, steady and fierce. "Look at me." She waited until those frightened eyes met hers. "No one is taking you anywhere. Not you, not anyone. Do you understand me? Elizabeth hesitated. But what if? No what ifs, Eleanor said. You're my daughter now. All of you are my children. And I would burn this entire territory to the ground before I let Harold Winters lay a finger on any of you. The words seemed to light something inside the girl, wonder first, then belief. You really mean that, Elizabeth whispered. I really mean that. The child launched forward, arms wrapping tight around Eleanor's neck, clutching with a desperation born of too many goodbyes. Eleanor held her until the sobs turned to hiccups, then to sleep. When she carried her inside later, the girl didn't let go even in her dreams. Timothy, at 3 years old, was the easiest. He had no memory of life before the ranch, no comprehension of laws or threats. To him, Eleanor was simply Mama, the woman who read to him from the picture books, who taught him to shape letters in the dirt, who lifted him high enough to touch the low branches of the cottonwood. He was sunlight personified, pure trust, pure laughter. And for that, Eleanor loved him with an ache that frightened her, because children like Timothy reminded her what she'd lost, and what she still had the courage to protect. But Mary, baby Mary, was different. Only 18 months old, she was a child of quiet observation. She didn't speak much, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched everyone, Ruth's hands kneading dough, Samuel's posture. When he worked the forge, Eleanor's every movement, as though calculating safety. Eleanor didn't rush her. She knew enough about wounded creatures to let them come in their own time. She was simply there, constant, soft-spoken, a steady presence in the background of Mary's small world. She hummed old hymns while she rocked her traced letters on her palm, whispered stories about angels and prairie stars. Gradually, Mary began to reach for her, to nestle into her shoulder after naps, to toddle after her from room to room, murmuring "Mama" in a voice that turned Eleanor's heart to glass. Then one night Mary woke screaming. Eleanor was at her cradle in seconds, gathering the trembling child into her arms. "Shh, sweetheart, Mama's here." The baby's sobs came in hiccups. "Mama, stay," she whimpered. "Mama, stay." Always, Eleanor breathed. Always, baby girl. "I'm not leaving you." Mary's tiny hands fisted in her nightgown, clutching like she meant to anchor her there forever. Eleanor rocked her until the screams turned to sighs, until the warmth of their breathing matched. When she finally looked up, Silas was standing in the doorway, shadowed by lamplight. His expression was unreadable, something between reverence and ache. Later, after Mary had fallen asleep again, he said quietly, "You love them." It wasn't a question. Eleanor met his gaze. "With everything I am, even though they're not. They are mine," she said fiercely. "Blood doesn't make a family, Silas. Choice does. Love does. The will to fight for someone, that's what makes you theirs." He stepped closer, voice low. "And you'll fight until my last breath." For a long moment they just stood there, the only sound the crackle of the dying fire. Then Silas reached out, cupped her face, and kissed her, slow, certain, grateful. It wasn't the desperate kind of kiss born of loneliness, but one shaped by shared purpose, by respect, and the quiet astonishment of finding something whole amid ruins. When he drew back, his forehead rested against hers. "We're going to win this," he said. Eleanor nodded, her voice a whisper against his. "Yes, we are." Outside, the night deepened. The stars burned cold and bright above the valley, scattered like promises waiting to be kept. And inside that modest house at Red Willow Creek, the beginnings of a family broken, stitched together, and fiercely alive, finally learned what it meant to belong. The storm. 10 days after Eleanor's arrival, Harold Winters returned. This time he brought 5 men, the lawyer, Sheriff Thompson, and 3 others Eleanor didn't recognize. They rode up to the house at noon when the children were eating lunch, and Silas was out checking the southern fence line. Eleanor saw them coming from the kitchen window. Her heart kicked up, but her hands stayed steady as she set down the pot she'd been washing. "Ruth," she said quietly, "take the children upstairs. All of them. Don't come down no matter what you hear." Ruth's face went white, but she obeyed instantly, herding her siblings up the stairs with practiced efficiency. Eleanor waited until she heard the loft door close. Then she took the Winchester from above the door, checked that it was loaded, and stepped onto the porch. Harold's smile was triumphant as he dismounted. Mrs. Pale, How domestic you've become, Mr. Winters. You're trespassing. I have legal authority." He gestured to Sheriff Thompson, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Show her the writ." The sheriff unfolded a document with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Hale, Judge Morrison has issued a temporary custody order based on allegations of child endangerment and unlicensed operation of an orphanage. I'm authorized to remove the children for their own protection pending a full investigation." Eleanor didn't take her eyes off Harold. "Judge Morrison is in Mr. Winters' pocket. Everyone in Red Willow Creek knows it. The law is the law," the lawyer said smugly. "Unless you want to be charged with obstruction of justice, I suggest you cooperate." Eleanor raised the Winchester, not aiming at anyone yet, but making her position clear. "The law is also changing. Federal child labor investigators have been notified of Mr. Winters' attempt to acquire child workers through legal manipulation. Territorial governor has received documentation of Judge Morrison's corruption, and every newspaper within 100 miles has been sent detailed accounts of this situation." Harold's smile faltered. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Eleanor's voice was cold. "Sheriff Thompson, before you take one child from this house, you should ask yourself something. When the federal marshals arrive, and they will arrive, do you want to be known as the man who helped a textile mill owner traffic children, or the man who stood on the right side of justice?" The sheriff's face had gone pale. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. Your job is to protect people, not deliver them to exploitation." Eleanor's gaze swept to the three strangers Harold had brought. "And you men you know what Mr. Winters wants with these children. He owns a textile mill. He wants workers. He can pay pennies and control completely. Is that really worth whatever he's paying you?" One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Another muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. Harold's face was flushing red with anger. "This is absurd. Sheriff, I demand you do your duty. And Mrs. Hale—" A shout from the road cut him off. Eleanor's heart soared. Reverend Morrison was riding hard toward the house, and behind him 20, 30, maybe 40 people from Red Willow Creek. The blacksmith, Miss Pritchard, the doctor, families Eleanor had visited. Families she'd never met but who'd heard the story and come anyway. They surrounded Harold's party, a wall of witnesses that made any violent action impossible. Sheriff Thompson, Reverend Morrison said, dismounting with surprising agility for a man his age, "I've just come from the telegraph office. The territorial governor's office has suspended Judge Morrison pending investigation. That writ you're holding, it's worthless." The sheriff looked at the paper in his hand as if it had turned into a snake. The doctor stepped forward. "I'll testify before any legitimate court that these children are healthy, well cared for, and showing absolutely no signs of abuse or neglect. Miss Pritchard," added, "Ruth Hale, is one of my students. She's brilliant, well-adjusted, and clearly loved. This family is doing right by these children." One by one, the townspeople spoke, brief testimonials, but dozens of them, creating an overwhelming chorus of support that couldn't be dismissed or silenced. Harold looked around at the gathering crowd, at his hired men starting to back away at the sheriff's wavering resolve. His carefully constructed legal strategy was falling apart. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Eleanor lowered the Winchester slightly. "Yes, it is. You've lost Mr. Winters. Go home." For a moment, Harold just stared at her, this schoolteacher from Pennsylvania, who'd somehow become the immovable center of a family he'd thought would be easy to break apart. Then something shifted in his face. The arrogance crumbled, revealing something raw underneath. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking. "I had a son, Thomas. He was 8 years old. There was an accident at the mill, a machine malfunction, and Harold's hands shook. "He died because I wasn't watching carefully enough. Because I was too focused on profits to maintain proper safety standards." The crowd had gone silent. Even Eleanor felt her anger waver. "These children," Harold continued, tears now streaming down his face. "I thought if I could save them, discipline them, teach them to survive in the world I created, I thought it would somehow redeem what I did to Thomas. I thought—" He choked on a sob. "I thought if I could keep them safe, it would mean I wasn't a monster who killed his own son." Eleanor felt something in her chest crack open. Not sympathy exactly, but understanding. Harold wasn't pure evil. He was a broken man trying to atone for an unforgivable mistake in the most broken way possible. "Mr. Winters," she said quietly, "you can't save your son by destroying other children. You can't atone for neglect through control. If you want to honor Thomas's memory, go back to Pennsylvania and make your mill safe. Hire adult workers at fair wages. Use your wealth to protect children instead of exploiting them." Harold looked at her with red, swollen eyes. "It's too late for me. It's never too late to stop causing harm," Eleanor said. "You can't undo the past. None of us can. But you can choose right now to walk away from this family and let these children have the life your son never got to live." The silence stretched. Then Harold nodded once a sharp, defeated gesture and climbed back onto his horse. "I'm sorry," he said, to no one and everyone. Then he rode away, his hired men and the useless sheriff following in his wake. Eleanor watched until they disappeared. Then her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the porch steps, the Winchester clattering beside her. The townspeople erupted in cheers, but Eleanor barely heard them. She was too busy trying to remember how to breathe around the enormity of what had just happened. Silas came riding in at a gallop, having been alerted by Samuel, who'd ridden to find him. He was off his horse before it fully stopped, gathering Eleanor into his arms. "You did it," he breathed. "You actually did it." "We did it," Eleanor corrected, clinging to him. "All of us." The loft door burst open, and 7 children came flying down, Ruth and Samuel, the twins Elizabeth, Timothy, Mary, all of them piling onto the porch in a tangle of arms and tears and relieved laughter. "Is he really gone?" Elizabeth asked, her voice shaking. "He's really gone," Eleanor confirmed, pulling the girl close. "And he's not coming back." But Eleanor's instincts proved correct. Harold Winters came back one more time 5 days later in the gray light before dawn. Eleanor woke to the sound of horses, many horses, and men's voices outside. She threw on her robe and rushed downstairs to find Silas already at the window, rifle in hand. "How many?" she asked. 6. Harold the lawyer and 4 others. One's wearing a sheriff's badge. Silas's face was grim. "He's brought force." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "On what grounds does it matter? If that sheriff is on his payroll." A fist pounded the door. "Silas Hale. This is Sheriff Parker. From the territorial capital, I have a writ of temporary custody due to allegations of child endangerment. Open up." The children were appearing now, Samuel, Ruth, all of them drawn by the commotion. Their faces showed the same careful blankness Eleanor had seen that first day, children preparing for adults to fail them again. "No," Eleanor said. The word came out harder than she'd intended. She moved to the door, checked the Winchester leaning against the wall, then looked back at Silas. "Did you write those letters I asked you to? To the territorial governor? The federal marshal? The newspapers?" "Yes, but Eleanor, they won't arrive for weeks. Then we buy time." She turned to Samuel. "Ride to town. Get Reverend Morrison and everyone you can find. Tell them Harold Winters is trying to take the children by force. Tell them we need witnesses." Samuel was out the back door before she finished speaking. Eleanor opened the front door to find Harold and the sheriff on her porch. Harold's face was triumphant. The sheriff looked uncomfortable but determined. "Mrs. Hale," the sheriff said, not meeting her eyes, "I have legal authority to remove these children pending investigation of child endangerment claims." "What claims specifically?" Eleanor kept her voice level. Harold answered, pulling out a document. "Multiple instances of child labor violations. Insufficient education. Crowded, unsanitary living conditions, lies." Eleanor's voice cut like glass. "Every word is a lie, and you know it, Mr. Winters. The law doesn't require proof, Mrs. Hale. Only reasonable suspicion." Harold smiled. "And I've provided plenty of that." Behind Eleanor, Mary started to cry. Ruth pulled her close, whispering comfort. The twins flanked Elizabeth protectively. These children had lived through this before, the terror of adults making decisions that would tear their lives apart. Eleanor made a choice. She stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind her, leaving the children inside. When she spoke, her voice carried across the yard loud enough for Harold's hired men to hear. Sheriff Parker, before you take one child from this house, you should know something. 3 days ago, my husband sent letters to the territorial governor, the federal marshal, and 3 newspapers detailing Mr. Winters' attempts to acquire child workers through legal manipulation. We documented everything, including Mr. Winters' confession that he wants these children for his mill. The sheriff's discomfort deepened. Ma'am, I have legal authority issued by Judge Morrison, who's currently under federal investigation for corruption. Yes, we know. Eleanor's gaze swept to Harold. We also know that child labor laws are changing, that federal authorities are investigating textile mills in Pennsylvania, that if you take these children, and word gets out, which it will, you'll face charges of human trafficking. Harold's face went red. You're bluffing. Am I? Eleanor smiled, and it was not kind. Sheriff, you're from the capital. You have a reputation to protect. Do you really want your name attached to this when the federal marshals arrive? When the newspapers print their stories? The sheriff looked at Harold, then back at Eleanor. Mr. Winters, maybe we should wait until she's a schoolteacher. Harold exploded. You're going to let a schoolteacher intimidate you into... No, a new voice said. They all turned. Reverend Morrison was climbing down from a wagon, and behind him, Eleanor's heart soared, were at least 30 townspeople, more than before. The schoolteacher, the general store owner, the blacksmith, the doctor. Families who'd seen the Hale children in town, seen them well-fed and happy, and behind them, riding a horse with unmistakable authority, was a man in a dark suit, carrying federal credentials. I'm Federal Marshal William Bradford, he announced, dismounting smoothly. I received detailed correspondence about this situation from Mrs. Eleanor Hale. He looked at Eleanor with something like respect. Very thorough correspondence, I might add, with extensive documentation. Eleanor felt tears of relief sting her eyes. The letters had worked. The federal government had actually responded. Marshal Bradford, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing this situation to federal attention, Mrs. Hale. Child labor laws are evolving, and cases like this, where children are acquired under false pretenses for commercial exploitation, are exactly what we're working to prevent. He turned to Harold. Mr. Winters, I'll need you to come with me. There are questions about your business practices that require immediate investigation. Harold's face had gone from red to gray. This is a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. We've received testimonials from multiple former child workers at your Pennsylvania textile mill describing conditions that violate federal statutes. Mrs. Hale's letters prompted us to investigate more thoroughly. Marshal Bradford's voice hardened. You should have left this family alone. Sheriff Parker looked between Harold and the federal marshal, clearly calculating where his loyalties should lie. Finally, he folded the writ and tucked it away. I believe I've been operating under false information, he said carefully. My apologies, Mrs. Hale. For a long moment, Harold just stood there, the full weight of his failure and his crimes crashing down on him. Then, unexpectedly, he started to cry. Not quiet tears, but wrenching sobs that shook his whole body. I just wanted to save them, he gasped. My son died because of me, because I chose profit over safety. I thought if I could save other children, if I could give them structure and discipline and purpose, it would mean Thomas didn't die for nothing. It would mean I wasn't. I wasn't a murderer, Eleanor said quietly. Not cruelly, but honestly. Harold looked up at her, his face devastated. Yes. Eleanor took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This man had threatened her family, had tried to steal her children, had caused weeks of fear and preparation and sleepless nights. But he was also a father, destroyed by grief and guilt, trying desperately to atone in all the wrong ways. Mr. Winters, she said your son's death was a tragedy, but you can't bring him back by controlling other children. That's not redemption. It's perpetuation of harm. How do you live with it, Harold whispered. How do you love children again after losing one? How do you risk your heart? Eleanor thought about James, her sweet boy, who died choking on his own breath. About the husband who'd hanged himself rather than face a world without their son. About the 3 years she'd spent as a ghost, going through motions, convinced her capacity for love had died with them. Because loving them isn't a risk, she said finally. It's the only thing that makes the risk of living worthwhile. My son died. Your son died. We can't bring them back, but we can honor their memories by protecting other children, not by exploiting them, but by giving them the chance to be children, to be loved, to be free. I don't know how to do that, Harold said, tears still streaming. Then learn. Eleanor's voice was firm but not unkind. Go back to Pennsylvania. Make your mills safe. Pay adult workers fair wages. Fund a school for workers' children. Create something that would make Thomas proud, instead of perpetuating the negligence that killed him. That's how you honor his memory. Harold nodded slowly, like a man waking from a long nightmare. I'm sorry, he said, looking at Eleanor, at Silas, who'd come to stand beside his wife, at the children peering from the windows. I'm so sorry. I know, Eleanor said. Now prove it by doing better. Marshal Bradford took Harold's arm gently, not as a prisoner, but as someone being guided toward necessary reckoning. Come on, Mr. Winters. We have much to discuss. As they rode away, Harold the Marshal, the chastened Sheriff Parker, the crowd erupted in celebration. But Eleanor just sat down on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Silas sat beside her, pulling her against his chest. It's really over now. It's really over. The children came pouring out, no longer careful, no longer guarded. They surrounded Eleanor and Silas in a tangle of arms and tears, and relieved laughter and questions that tumbled over each other. We're safe, Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling with hope and disbelief. You're safe, Eleanor confirmed, pulling the girl onto her lap despite Elizabeth's sighs. All of you, forever and always. I promise. Samuel knelt beside Eleanor, his young face serious. You really did it. You saved us. We saved each other, Eleanor corrected, reaching out to cup his cheek. That's what families do. The days after. The week following Harold's final defeat felt almost dreamlike. The constant tension that had hummed through the house since Eleanor's arrival finally dissipated, and the children began to truly relax for the first time in 2 years. But with that relaxation came something unexpected: grief. Not new grief, but old grief that had been pushed down and ignored while they all focused on survival. Now, with safety finally established, the children had space to mourn what they'd lost. Margaret, their birth parents, the innocence that had been stolen by too much loss, too young. Ruth was the first to break. 3 days after Harold left, Eleanor found her in the kitchen at dawn, sitting at the table with her head in her arms, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ruth's sweetheart Eleanor sat beside her, hand gentle on the girl's back. What's wrong? I miss her, Ruth choked out. I miss Ma Margaret so much. And I feel awful because you're here now and you're wonderful, but missing her feels like being disloyal to you, and I don't know how to stop. Eleanor pulled Ruth into her arms. Listen to me. Loving me doesn't mean you can't miss Margaret. Accepting me as your mother doesn't erase what she was to you. Hearts are big enough for both, Ruth. They're big enough for all the people who've loved us, living and dead. But it hurts, Ruth whispered. It still hurts so much. I know. And it probably always will, at least a little. But that hurt is proof of love, Ruth. It's proof that she mattered, that what you had together was real and precious. Don't run from that pain. Let it exist alongside your happiness. That's what it means to honor someone's memory. Ruth cried for a long time, deep cleansing tears that she'd been holding back for months. When she finally pulled away, her face was blotchy and swollen, but something in her eyes looked lighter. Thank you, she said, for understanding, for not being hurt that I still love her. Oh, sweetheart. Eleanor smoothed Ruth's hair back from her face. I'd be worried if you didn't. Margaret helped make you who you are. She's part of your story, and I'm honored to be part of the next chapter, not threatened by the chapters that came before. The twins struggled in a different way. Without the immediate threat to focus on their anxiety manifested as hypervigilance, they started waking multiple times per night, checking windows and doors. Michael developed a habit of counting family members, obsessively making sure all 9 people were accounted for, before he could relax. Matthew became clingy with the horses, spending hours in the barn, as if the animal's presence could substitute for human unreliability. Eleanor recognized trauma responses. She'd seen similar behaviors in students who'd experienced loss or violence, so she worked with Silas to create new routines that built security without feeding the anxiety. They established a nightly ritual. Before bed, the whole family gathered in the main room. Each person shared one good thing from their day and one thing they were looking forward to tomorrow. Then, Silas checked all the locks while the children watched, verbalizing what he was doing. Front door locked, back door locked, windows secured, everyone safe. It seemed almost silly, but within a week the twins' nighttime wandering decreased. The verbal confirmation of safety helped their anxious minds release the need to constantly check. Elizabeth's healing took a different form. With the threat gone, she began testing boundaries, small acts of defiance that seemed designed to check whether Eleanor's love was conditional. She forgot her garden chores. She talked back during lessons. She was sullen and difficult at meals. Eleanor recognized it for what it was: a child who'd been abandoned multiple times, checking whether this mother would abandon her too when she wasn't perfect. So Eleanor stayed steady. She enforced consequences for genuine misbehavior, but never withdrew affection. She continued to seek Elizabeth out, to praise her genuine efforts, to make clear that her love wasn't contingent on Elizabeth's performance. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of Elizabeth's testing, Eleanor found the girl crying in her room. "I don't know why I'm being so awful," Elizabeth sobbed. "You've been nothing but kind, and I keep being horrible, and I don't know how to stop." Eleanor sat on the edge of Elizabeth's bed. "You're checking to see if I'll leave when you're not perfect. You're testing whether my love is real or just performance. You want to know, will she stay when I'm difficult? Will she still want me when I'm not? The quiet, helpful girl who doesn't make problems." Elizabeth stared at her, stunned. "How did you know?" "Because I'm a mother, and because I understand that children who've been left behind learn to create distance first, to control the abandonment by making it happen on their terms." Eleanor took Elizabeth's hand. "But here's what you need to know: I'm not leaving. Not when you're difficult. Not when you're testing me. Not when you make mistakes. I'm your mother now, and that means forever. So you can stop testing Elizabeth. You already passed." The girl threw herself into Eleanor's arms and cried deep, cathartic sobs that seemed to release something that had been locked inside her for years. And from that day forward, the testing stopped. Elizabeth wasn't perfect, children never were, but she stopped sabotaging her own happiness. Samuel's healing came through action. With Harold's threat resolved, he threw himself into ranch work with renewed energy. He was up before dawn, working past sunset, driving himself to exhaustion day after day. Silas noticed first. "He's working too hard," he said to Eleanor one evening. "He's going to hurt himself." Eleanor had noticed too. "He's trying to prove his worth, trying to earn his place here by being indispensable. But he doesn't need to earn anything. He's my son." "Your son by choice," Eleanor said gently. "Which means part of him still believes that choice can be unmade. He needs to understand that he's valuable for who he is, not what he does." So Silas started taking Samuel on rides that had nothing to do with work. Just father and son riding through the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. Silas shared stories of his own childhood, his dreams, his failures. He made clear that Samuel didn't need to be perfect, or even particularly useful. He just needed to be Samuel. One evening, they returned from one of these rides to find Eleanor had prepared Samuel's favorite meal. When he started to thank her by listing all the work he'd completed that day, Silas cut him off gently. "Sam, you don't need to justify your existence by reciting accomplishments. You're valuable because you're our son, because we love you, because you're you. That's enough. That's more than enough." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "But what if I'm not? What if I stop being useful, and you realize that we love you anyway?" Eleanor finished. "Samuel, love isn't a transaction. You can't earn it, and you can't lose it. It's just given, freely, because you're ours." The young man really broke down crying. And in his tears, Eleanor saw the final walls coming down, the last defenses crumbling. Samuel was finally letting himself be a child again, letting himself be loved without conditions. Timothy and Mary, being so young, processed everything differently. For them, the drama of Harold's visits was already fading into that fuzzy space of early childhood memories, more feeling than fact. What mattered to them was the present. Was Mama here? Was Papa here? Were they safe and loved? Right now, the answer was always yes. Mary grew bold and demanding, as toddlers should be. She ordered her older siblings around, insisted on doing things by myself, and threw spectacular tantrums when thwarted. Eleanor found it all deeply reassuring. This was normal child development, not trauma response. Timothy started asking questions, endless, exhausting questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where do babies come from? What happens when we die? Why don't horses talk? Can I have a puppy? Eleanor answered each question with patience and honesty appropriate to his age. Because questions meant curiosity, and curiosity meant a child who felt safe enough to explore his world. And through it all, Eleanor and Silas were building their own relationship, moving beyond the practical partnership of crisis management to something deeper and more intimate. They stole moments together, early morning coffee before the children woke, late evening talks on the porch after the house settled, rides to check distant fencing that were really excuses to be alone together. They learned each other's bodies and hearts with the careful attention of people who'd both loved and lost before. This wasn't the headlong rush of young love. This was something more deliberate, a choice made again and again, day after day, to build something lasting. One night, lying in bed with Silas's arm around her waist and his breath warm on her neck, Eleanor realized she was completely, perfectly happy. Not the giddy happiness of new romance, but the deep contentment of being exactly where she belonged. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Silas murmured back. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for becoming the heart of this family. Thank you for being honest enough to admit you needed help, and brave enough to marry a stranger." "Best decision I ever made," Silas said, pulling her closer. "Even if you are terrifyingly competent and occasionally frighten me with your strategic planning abilities." Eleanor laughed. "I'm not that scary. You faced down Harold Winters with a rifle and won a psychological warfare battle against a man with money and legal connections. You're absolutely that scary, and I love it." They fell asleep, tangled together, two people who'd found each other through desperation and built something beautiful through determination. 2 years later, the courthouse in Red Willow Creek had never seen a crowd like this. By mid-morning, the old brick building was bursting, benches, filled windows, fogged from the warmth of too many bodies, and the hum of conversation. People lined the walls, spilled into the hallway, craned their necks through the open doors. It seemed the whole town had come, drawn by the simple miracle about to unfold, the legal sealing of what everyone already knew, that the Hales were in every way that mattered a family. At the front of the room, sunlight slanted through tall windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Judge Harrison, a broad-shouldered man with white hair and a kind face, surveyed the packed courtroom with quiet satisfaction. He had replaced the disgraced Judge Morrison after federal investigators uncovered corruption and bribery. Where Morrison's court had reeked of arrogance, Harrison smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and decency. He cleared his throat, a smile tugging his mouth. "In 30 years of presiding over adoptions," he said, "I've seen my share of families come together. But I can honestly say I've never seen a case quite like this." A murmur rippled through the room. Harrison gestured toward the table where the family Saturday, Mr. and Mrs. Hale, Eleanor and Silas, and your children. "Would you please stand?" Eleanor rose first, her hand steady, though her heart fluttered. Silas stood beside her, broad and quiet as ever. Around them, 7 children unfolded like the notes of a well-loved song. 2 years had changed them all. Samuel, now 17, stood straight-backed and tall, his face open and unguarded at last. The boy who had once carried the weight of an entire household on his shoulders was now a young man ready for the world. In a few months, he would leave for the Territorial College's agriculture program, the first Hale to attend higher education. But what mattered most was how freely he laughed these days, how easily he trusted that the people he loved would still be there in the morning. Ruth, 15, shone with quiet confidence. She had completed 2 years of correspondence coursework toward her teacher's certificate, and now helped Miss Pritchard at the schoolhouse 3 afternoons a week. She spoke her mind at town meetings, organized reading circles for the younger children, and though she blushed furiously when asked, had started keeping company with the blacksmith's eldest son. Watching her now, Eleanor felt the familiar tug of pride, mingled with a mother's ache for time's swift passing. Michael and Matthew 11 stood side by side, as always, though their differences had grown clear. Michael's pockets bulged with sketches of machines and gear parts. He'd already improved several pieces of ranch equipment, saving Silas hours of labor. Matthew, meanwhile, had become the resident animal whisperer. Half the ranchers in the valley now came to him for help with nervous horses or sick calves. They were twin reflections of curiosity and compassion rooted deeply in this land. Elizabeth, 13, was nearly unrecognizable from the timid girl who had once hidden behind her siblings. Her posture was proud, her face sun-warmed from long hours in the garden she now ran as a small business. She supplied vegetables to 3 neighboring ranches and had begun teaching younger children how to grow their own. The dirt under her nails was a badge of freedom. Timothy, 5, vibrated with barely contained energy. He fidgeted beside Silas, his suspenders slightly crooked, whispering questions to anyone who'd listen. At school, he was both a delight and a trial to his teacher, charming one moment, impossible the next, but entirely alive exactly as a 5-year-old should be. And then there was Mary, nearly 4, the family's unchallenged monarch. Her curls framed a round face full of mischief. She clung to Eleanor's skirt, unbothered by the solemnity of the occasion. She had no memories of fear or loss, only the warm, constant rhythm of love. Judge Harrison looked them over with genuine warmth. Samuel, Ruth, Michael, Matthew, Elizabeth, Timothy, and Mary, he said slowly, as if giving each name its due weight. You've endured more than most adults ever will. You've known hunger and uncertainty and grief, and yet here you stand, a family, not bound by blood, but by something stronger. Love chosen, love proved. He turned to Eleanor and Silas, and you too well. You've reminded this community that parenthood is not a matter of biology. It's a daily act of courage. He reached for his pen. It is my great honor to finalize the legal adoption of Samuel Hale, Ruth Hale, Michael Hale, Matthew Hale, Elizabeth Hale, Timothy Hale, and Mary Hale. May your home remain a light on this frontier, a testament to chosen love. The pen scratched across the parchment. Congratulations, he said, looking up with a smile. You are officially and permanently a family. For a heartbeat, silence hung in the air. Then the room erupted, cheers, applause, laughter, tears. People rose from their seats, clapping, calling out blessings. The children pressed in around Eleanor and Silas, arms wrapping voices, overlapping laughter, breaking through tears. Townsfolk came forward with handshakes and hugs, the sound of joy echoing off the courthouse walls. Eleanor caught sight of Marshal Bradford near the back. He'd come all the way from the Capitol to witness the event. Their eyes met, and he gave a small, solemn nod. Not just victory for one family, but for every unconventional household on the frontier, every child who needed love more than lineage. That afternoon, the ranch shimmered with celebration. The valley had not seen such a gathering in years. Long wooden tables stretched under the cottonwoods, groaning under the weight of food, brought by half the county, roasted chickens, platters of cornbread, jars of pickled vegetables, pies cooled on gingham cloths. The air smelled of smoke and honey, and the faint sweetness of spring grass. A fiddler struck up a tune while children tore across the field, shouting and tumbling. Women clustered near the tables, gossiping and laughing. Men leaned on fence rails, swapping stories between bites of cake. The rhythm of ordinary joy, raucous, full, alive, filled every corner of the land. Eleanor moved through it all like a steady flame. She hugged neighbors, thanked friends, and accepted congratulations with modest smiles. But even as she laughed and visited part of her attention, stayed tuned to her children, an instinct she couldn't switch off. Her gaze found them easily in the crowd like landmarks she knew by heart. Samuel danced with Miss Pritchard, clumsy but fearless, both laughing at his missteps. Ruth stood near the cider barrels, deep in conversation with a territorial representative about improving teacher pay. The twins demonstrated their latest invention, an automatic gate latch, to a semicircle of impressed ranchers. Elizabeth sat cross-legged, with a group of younger children weaving flower crowns and talking about soil, as though it were treasure. Timothy and Mary ran wild with the other little ones, shrieking in a game that seemed to have no rules beyond joy itself. Silas appeared beside Eleanor, carrying 2 tin cups of punch. "They're happy," he said, watching their brood scatter like sparks across the yard. "They are," she replied, smiling. "Finally." He handed her the drink. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Because of us. You built the foundation. I just helped hold the roof in place." Silas leaned down and kissed her temple. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Only twice," she teased. "You're falling behind schedule." He laughed, a free, unguarded sound that still surprised her sometimes. "Well then, I love you, Eleanor Hale. I love your fierceness, and that mind of yours that never stops building something better out of chaos. You've made this family more than I ever dreamed possible." Her throat tightened. "I love you too. Thank you for being brave enough to write that letter in the first place." He chuckled. "Brave or foolish?" "Both," she said. "And thank you for lying to me." His eyebrows rose. "That's a strange thing to thank a woman for." "If you hadn't lied," she said, smiling softly, "I might never have come." He brushed his thumb across her knuckles. "And thank you for staying when you found out the truth. For choosing us." "I'll keep choosing you," she said. "Every day." The fiddler's tune shifted to something slow and tender. Silas offered his hand. "Dance with me." Eleanor laughed. "In front of everyone? They already know we're fools for each other." She let him lead her to the open space near the fire pit. The crowd cheered as they began to sway in the soft evening light, her skirts brushing the grass, his arm firm around her waist. The horizon blazed orange and gold behind them. The air smelled of lilac and smoke. Around them, laughter music and the rustle of wind through cottonwoods blended into something that felt like grace. When the song ended, Silas kissed her, unhurried, certain. The children clapped, embarrassed and delighted. Someone shouted for another tune, and the fiddler obliged. Eleanor looked around at the faces glowing in the lantern light. Neighbors, friends, children who had once flinched at every sound, and now danced barefoot in the dust, and felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. Life was strange, she thought. You could lose everything, home, husband, child, even the will to live, and still somehow be led to something larger. Sometimes emptiness was just space waiting to be filled with something better than what came before. She reached for Silas's hand again as the next song began. The stars were coming out over Red Willow Creek, and laughter carried across the darkening fields. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Hale stopped bracing for loss. She simply lived. After the guests had finally left and the children were exhaustedly asleep, Eleanor stood on the porch under the familiar Wyoming stars. She'd pulled out the old letters from Pennsylvania, the ones from people asking if she'd come to her senses and returned to civilization. She'd never answered them, but now she took out paper and wrote one final response. "Dear friends, you asked if I'd found what I was looking for in Wyoming territory. The truth is, I found something I didn't know I was searching for. I came west thinking I was running away from grief, from failure, from a life that had become unbearable. But I wasn't running away. I was running towards something my heart knew I needed, even if my mind couldn't articulate it. I found 7 children who needed someone to fight for them. I found a man who understood that love is a verb, not just a feeling. I found a community that values what you do over who your parents were. I found purpose that extends beyond my own comfort. The frontier stories I read as a girl were always about cowboys and gunfights and manifest destiny. They never told the real truth about the West, that it's a place where you can become who you were always meant to be, if you're brave enough to let go of who you thought you should be. These Western stories, these Old West stories about families built by choice rather than blood, they're not romantic fantasies. Their daily work, they're choosing love even when it's hard.